Ever get stuck in that kind of tricky spot where
Yeah.
it's like what you should do and what feels right are totally different things? That's what we're going to dive into today. It's a question people have thought about forever. Philosophers, yeah, but honestly, probably all of us at some point.
Mm.
Like, do we follow those rules of the world, or do we listen to what feels right deep down, like those rules of the spirit?
It really is like that question gets to the heart of how we figure out life, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So to help us out, we're looking at this article from the Spiritual Seek website. It's called, Should We Follow the Rules of the World or Those of the Spirit?
Pretty direct, right? But I have a feeling things are going to get kind of complicated.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
When you're talking about, like, those outside structures and what we believe deep down, things can get messy, for sure. Okay, so to make sure we're all on the same page, the article starts by defining these two sets of rules, right?
Worldly rules.
Worldly rules, those are things like societal norms, laws, all those systems that keep things running smoothly. And then you have spiritual rules, which are more about your own personal ethics, like stuff that comes from your beliefs or your philosophical ideas. But it's easy to just say worldly equals bad, spiritual equals good, and I think that's way too simple.
You're right. It's definitely more nuanced than that. Like, think about it. Even something like traffic laws, which seem pretty basic, right? Those are worldly rules, and they're there to stop chaos and keep us safe. Structure isn't automatically bad. The problem comes when those structures get too rigid, when they start to limit individual freedoms, or even worse, when they're used to keep unfair systems going.
Yeah, it's like, how do we know when those rules need to be questioned or even like challenged? History is full of examples where people had to stand up against laws that everyone thought were right at the time, but were actually deeply unjust.
That's exactly it. And that's where the rules of the spirit become important. It's like having your own internal compass. It guides you to do what's ethical, even when it goes against those external rules. Of course, this gets complicated too, because what feels ethically right changes from person to person. It depends on their beliefs.
Okay, so then how do we reconcile those differences? Let's say someone feels really strongly guided by their spiritual beliefs
Yeah.
to, for example, engage in civil disobedience, which obviously puts them at odds with the law, right? How do we navigate that kind of tension?
That's where understanding the purpose and the potential problems of both sets of rules becomes so important. It's about realizing that neither one is the absolute authority.
And this is where it gets really interesting. Because the article says that worldly rules are often made for practical reasons, like keeping order, shaping cultural identity. But they can fall short when it comes to those deeper moral questions, like when a law itself is unethical.
And on the other hand, relying only on your gut can be tricky too. We all have biases, things we don't see. If we don't think critically about our own beliefs and think about the bigger picture, we could end up doing things that are harmful, even if they feel right to us at the time.
So it sounds like it's less about picking a side, world versus spirit, and more about understanding how they work together and finding that balance. The article talks about situational awareness, and I think that's important here.
Totally. Being aware of the context you're in is key. Are you in a situation where following the rules is crucial for safety or fairness? Or is there space to use your own judgment based on your moral principles?
And that judgment, that critical thinking, is what helps us figure out the best way to act. It's about asking ourselves, what could happen because of my choices? How do my actions affect other people? Am I being guided by fear or by a real desire to do what's right? And these aren't easy questions.
Definitely not. And this is where things can get even more complicated. Because even when we think we're making a totally ethical decision, there might be unconscious biases affecting us.
Okay, that's fascinating. So it's not just about being aware of the external rules and our internal compass, but also being aware of our own biases. That might be influencing how we see what's right. How do we even start to figure that out?
Well, one way is to look at different ethical frameworks, like utilitarianism. That focuses on doing the most good for the most people. And then there's deontology. That's about following moral rules and duties no matter the outcome. By understanding these frameworks, we can start to examine our own decision-making processes and see where those potential blind spots are.
So it's like adding another layer of complexity, another lens to view our choices through. And that makes me wonder, are there specific strategies or techniques that can help us navigate these complex ethical dilemmas?
There are, and we'll get into those in a bit. But before we move on, I'm curious what stood out to you so far in this conversation.
You know, what's really hitting me is this idea that we all have this responsibility to really think critically, to really examine our own beliefs and why we do things, and to be willing to challenge both the rules of the world and our own inner compass. It's not about blindly following either one, but about finding that space where we can make conscious, ethical choices.
I think that's a really powerful insight, and it's something we'll keep unpacking as we dive deeper into this article. It's kind of wild when you think about it. Like, even when we think we're making a totally personal choice, all these other things are influencing us. Societal expectations, our own beliefs, even those unconscious biases. It makes you realize that living a truly examined life, it takes constant work.
Yeah, totally. It's like we have to be detectives of our own motivations, always asking why and questioning those assumptions we make. And speaking of assumptions, the article has this fun little quiz called, Are you in the world or of the world?
Right, right. I remember that. It's that series of statements that makes you think about which set of rules you tend to lean on more.
Exactly. Like it'll say stuff like, rules are made to be broken, or it's important to fit in with the crowd. And depending on which ones you agree with, it tells you whether you're more of the world, meaning you're all about those external rules and norms, or in the world, which means you rely more on that inner compass.
Yeah, it's a fun way to think about it. But it brings up a good question. Can we really separate ourselves from the world and its rules? Even people who try to live by a super strict moral code, they still live in a society.
That's so true. It's not about trying to escape the world, is it? It's more about understanding how we relate to it, how we deal with those times when what's expected of us and what feels true to us clash.
Exactly. And the article gives some really good examples of these conflict situations. Like, what happens when you see someone doing something unethical at work? Do you just follow the company culture, the whole unwritten rule of keeping your head down? Or do you listen to that voice inside you that says to speak up, even if it means risking your job?
Oh, man, that is such a relatable problem. And it shows how this whole rules thing is a real-life issue. It's not just some philosophy debate. It's something we deal with every day.
It really is. And it can be hard, like whistleblowing. Everyone says it's brave, but it can really cost you personally. So how do we weigh those consequences against that feeling that we have to speak up against something wrong?
That's a tough one. It makes me think of those historical examples we were talking about earlier, like the civil rights movement. That wouldn't have happened if everyone had just followed the rules of segregation.
Uh,
Those activists were driven by a need for justice, a belief that those worldly rules were just plain wrong.
And they were ready to face jail violence, even death, to challenge those rules. They show us that sometimes listening to our moral compass means breaking away from societal norms, even when it's dangerous.
But it's not always about huge protests or revolutions, is it? This tension between the two types of rules happens in small personal ways, too, like in relationships. Let's say your friend starts gossiping about someone in a hurtful way. Do you go along with it just to keep things peaceful, or do you say something, even if it means you might lose that friend?
Every choice we make, every little one, even the big ones, it's a chance to either support or challenge those structures that are already there. And that's where personal responsibility is so important. The article really pushes this idea. It tells readers to really engage with both sets of rules. Don't just blindly follow one or the other.
So it's about finding that balance,
Right.
knowing when it's okay to conform for safety or to keep things smooth, and knowing when we need to push back against injustice or be true to what we believe. But how do we actually do that?
That is the question, isn't it? And thankfully, the article gives us some ideas. It emphasizes critical thinking, not just accepting things as they are.
So don't blindly follow rules, and don't blindly follow your gut either. Take a step back. Think about the situation. Consider what could happen because of your actions.
Right, and along with critical thinking, it encourages dialogue. Not just the conversations we have in our heads, but actually talking to people we trust, getting different perspectives, talking to people who see things differently, maybe even having conversations with people who represent worldly authority, like politicians, community leaders, and people who speak to the spiritual side, like philosophers, religious figures, even artists who explore these questions in their work.
Wow, I love that image. It's like those separate worlds, actually talking to each other, learning from each other. Imagine how much positive change we could create if we could have more of that. But on a personal level, how can we use this in our own lives? What are some things we can do when we face those tough decisions where the rules seem to clash?
Well, the article gives some practical advice, and it's surprisingly simple, but powerful too.
So we were talking about those practical steps, things we can actually do when we're in those situations where the rules of the world and what we feel inside are telling us to do different things. Like, where do we even start?
The article really emphasizes something we've been talking about this whole time. It's awareness. Not just knowing what's happening around you, but also being aware of what's going on inside yourself. Like, what emotions are you feeling? Are you acting out of fear, anger, a sense of obligation? Or are you grounded in your values? Even if those values lead you down a path that's less normal.
It's like that classic advice, take a deep breath before you react.
Yeah.
Create some space between what's happening and how you respond. So you can actually choose how you want to act instead of just getting carried away by the moment.
Exactly. That pause, that moment of reflection, it lets you tap into what the article calls your inner wisdom. It's that quiet voice inside that tells you what your values are, what feels right, even when it's tough.
But what if that voice is giving you mixed messages? What if you're torn between, like, wanting to help someone who needs it, but also knowing you need to take care of yourself too?
That's a real struggle, for sure. And it shows how important another suggestion from the article is. It's seeking guidance. Not necessarily in the sense of following someone else's rules, but more like having those meaningful conversations with people you trust. Mentors, spiritual advisors, even therapists, sometimes just talking things through can help you figure out your own thoughts and see those blind spots that we all have.
It's like we're not supposed to figure this all out on our own.
Right.
We need those outside perspectives to challenge how we think, to offer different ways of looking at things, and to remind us that there's not always just one right answer. But in the end, the decision is up to us.
Absolutely. And that leads us to the last step in the article, and it's probably the most important one. Trusting yourself. You've done the work. You've thought about the options. You've gotten advice. Now you have to choose. And trust that you're doing the best you can with what you know.
It's like taking a leap of faith, knowing that even if you mess up, you'll learn from it and adjust as you go. There's something really powerful about that, don't you think?
I totally agree. It's about recognizing that this journey of trying to match our actions with our values, it's something we do throughout our lives. It's not about being morally perfect, but about always trying to do better, to be more aware, and to make choices that show our integrity.
So we've come full circle, haven't we? We started with this question: should we follow the rules of the world or the rules of our spirit? And now we see that it's not about picking sides. It's about finding that balance between the two.
And it's a journey we all have to take in our own way. There's no one right answer, no magic solution. But by thinking about these questions in a deep way, by being aware, by getting advice, and by trusting ourselves, we can move through the world with a stronger sense of purpose and a feeling that we're being true to who we are.
That's a great way to put it. And on that note, we'll leave you to keep thinking about these things. Keep exploring. Keep asking those tough questions. And like always, keep diving deep.